She went to Charles's soirée expecting wine, gossip, and wounded pride, not a corpse face down in lemon sole. This is Agatha Raisin and Sir Charles Fraith's fatal soirée. Where in the world are you listening from tonight? Your comments make this cozy corner feel even warmer, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss the next mystery. Carsley spent the morning pretending to be spring. A thin sun wobbled over the honeystone cottages, lighting the damp hedgerows with a faint glow, as if the village were trying to look cheerful for company. Agatha Raisin did not trust it. The Cotswolds always put on an innocent face right before something annoying happened, and she had learnt to recognise the signs. She stood at her cottage window with a mug of coffee strong enough to stun a horse. Hodge sprawled along the radiator, stretching as if he expected applause. Agatha eyed him sourly. "You've no idea what it means to face the world," she muttered. Hodge blinked without interest. The knock at the door came as a crisp interruption. Agatha stiffened. Knocks before 10 usually meant Doris Simpson wanting a signature for a parcel, or worse, someone from the WI checking whether she intended to bake for Thursday's meeting. She opened the door with the look of a woman prepared for trouble, only to find the postman offering an envelope embossed with a gold crest. Charles Fraith's crest. She took it with the wary air of someone accepting a compliment that might explode. Once the postman left, she slit the envelope with her nail. Inside lay a cream card, thick and smug. Sir Charles Fraith requests the pleasure of your company at an intimate soirée. Agatha bristled at the word intimate. Charles had not wrung her in weeks. She imagined him lounging at his manor, surrounded by elegant women in silk, while she, foolish idiot, had spent 2 evenings worrying whether she'd offended him. Her vanity flared, followed immediately by her curiosity. She read the invitation again. A soirée, at Charles's, with new guests from London, art people probably, people who would sniff at her skirts and pretend not to stare at her hair. "Oh, no you don't," she muttered. "You won't make a fool of me." But of course, she already suspected he might. To prepare herself, Agatha marched to the Red Lion. If she was going to be insulted, she preferred it done with a gin and tonic in hand. The pub hummed with lunchtime gossip. Mr. John Fletcher sat at his usual table, reading the Mercester Herald with theatrical sighs. A pair of WI ladies whispered over shepherd's pie. Agatha slid onto a stool at the bar. Fred the landlord nodded. "Gin?" "Naturally." The glass had barely hit her fingers when the gossip began. "Have you heard about Charles's party?" whispered Mrs. Mason, appearing at her elbow like a helpful but persistent moth. Agatha feigned boredom. "Vaguely." "London lot, apparently. Artists and critics. And that columnist, Verity Lane." Mrs. Mason lowered her voice. "She's doing some series about country eccentrics." Agatha froze. "I am not an eccentric." "Of course not, dear," Mrs. Mason said cheerfully, patting her arm as if soothing a fractious child. Agatha swallowed her gin in one firm movement. The idea of appearing in a smug London column made her skin prickle. She pictured Verity Lane strolling into Carsley, notebook poised like a weapon, writing things like Agatha Raisin, a woman of robust enthusiasm and questionable hem lengths. Before she could recover, Doris Simpson bustled in, eyes gleaming. "Agatha, I heard you've been invited to Sir Charles's do." "And what of it?" Doris gave a bright, tactless smile. "Oh, nothing. Just wondered if he meant it as a joke." The gin nearly flew out of Agatha's nose. Laughter bubbled from a nearby table. Despite her strongest will, her cheeks flooded with heat. She stood abruptly. "I have better things to do than listen to village nonsense." "Of course you do," Doris called. "Wear something nice." Agatha escaped before she said something prosecutable. Back home, she stormed through her cottage in a tempest of indignation. Hodge observed from a safe distance, green eyes half closed as she threw open her wardrobe. Clothes flew across the bed. She muttered darkly at every blouse that had mysteriously shrunk and at every skirt that insisted on highlighting the hips she preferred to ignore. "You're no help," she told Hodge. He yawned. Agatha changed outfits 3 times, each more unsuitable than the last. The green dress made her look washed out. The red one was too bold, suggesting confidence she currently lacked. The black dress was perfect, but had a faint smell of smoke from her last attempt to quit smoking. By the time she settled on a tasteful navy number, her nerves felt grated. She lit a cigarette and paced the sitting room. "He ignores me for weeks, then expects me to turn up smiling. Another drag. And everyone thinks I'm the village clown. Another drag, harsher. If that columnist even looks at me strangely. The knock at the door startled her so much she nearly dropped ash on the rug. When she opened it, Mrs. Blocksby stood there, warm and calm as a cup of tea. "I hope I'm not disturbing you," the vicar's wife said. "No, no," Agatha said, though she clearly was. Mrs. Blocksby stepped inside with her usual serenity. "I heard about Charles's soirée." "Everyone has." Mrs. Blocksby smiled gently. "If you are going, you should be aware. Some guests at his previous parties left rather offended. Charles can be careless. He never means harm, but he often stumbles into it." Agatha frowned. "Offended how?" "Sharp remarks, social spats, a quarrel over a painting, I'm not entirely sure. But there was tension, and I suspect there may be more." Agatha's irritation gave way to the prickle of intrigue. So Charles had been stirring up art people again. That was just like him, charming, oblivious, and troublesome. Mrs. Blocksby regarded her kindly. "Be careful not to let his circle rattle you." Agatha sniffed. "I'm not so easily rattled." Mrs. Blocksby's eyes twinkled. "Of course." When she left, Agatha resumed pacing. She told herself she didn't care whether Charles noticed her. She didn't care if his London friends judged her. She didn't care what Verity Lane wrote, but even Hodge, flicking his tail, seemed to know better. Evening shadows stretched across the cottage as Agatha placed the invitation on the mantelpiece. She stared at it for a full minute. Then she picked it up again, smoothing the edge with her thumb. "Fine," she muttered. "If Charles wants me there, I'll go, and I'll show them all I'm not some ridiculous country relic." She slipped the invitation into her handbag with brisk finality. Hodge leapt onto the armchair, settling in for a nap. Agatha gave him a wry look. "Don't judge me. At least I'm doing something with my life." He closed his eyes, unconcerned. Agatha straightened her dress one last time. She checked her reflection, dabbed her lipstick, and told herself she felt confident. She did not remotely, but she was going anyway, which proved she cared far more than she wished. With a deep breath and a muttered oath, Agatha Raisin set off for Charles Fraith's soirée, quite sure nothing could possibly embarrass her this time. Fate, naturally, was already sharpening its claws. The Cotswold evening settled over Castley like a polite veil, thin enough to see through but cold enough to irritate anyone wearing the wrong coat. Agatha Raisin, who had changed coats twice, marched up the gravel drive to Sir Charles Fraith's manor with a determination that bordered on aggressive. She had told herself she was perfectly composed. She was not. Her nerves fizzed beneath her navy dress like soda trapped in a bottle. The manor rose out of the dusk with smug elegance. Soft candlelight glowed behind mullioned windows. The lawns looked freshly shorn, though Agatha noticed patches where the edges had been trimmed with the enthusiasm of someone working under protest. Charles had claimed budget adjustments on the phone, which Agatha suspected meant he had annoyed half his staff again. She smoothed her dress, squared her shoulders, and marched inside. The drawing room hummed with the forced gaiety of people pretending to enjoy themselves. Agatha paused just long enough to assess the crowd. Londoners everywhere, the sleek, the smug, the overgroomed. There were art dealers in alarming scarves, critics with angular spectacles, and a Mercester couple who looked as if they sharpened their elbows on weekdays. And then there was Verity Lane. The columnist gave Agatha a single up-and-down glance, the sort used by women who collect gossip the way others collect stamps. Verity's smile was faintly sympathetic, which irritated Agatha far more than open hostility. Before Agatha could fend her off, Charles finally appeared. He swept through the room in a haze of charm and laziness, greeting people with the air of a man accepting tribute. When he reached Agatha, he paused. "Oh, you made it," he said brightly. Agatha stared at him. "You did invite me." Yes. He turned toward the nearest circle of guests. "Everyone, this is my friend from Castley, Agatha Raisin, quite spirited." Agatha's cheeks tightened. She heard the real message, eccentric village busybody. She gripped her wineglass so hard she nearly snapped the stem. The humiliation stung. She recovered quickly, of course, she always did. She lifted her chin, offered a cool half-smile, and walked away before Charles could make it worse. She drifted through the room, listening. The conversations were full of glossy words and thin laughter. But beneath the surface lay tension. The air prickled with it. And at the centre stood Quentin Drury. He was an ageing art critic, tall and grey, with the air of a man who expected the world to apologise for existing incorrectly. His voice carried easily, slicing through the room. "Your pianist is dreadfully sentimental," Drury announced to anyone within earshot. The pianist, a young woman in trembling pearls, tried to smile. Her phrasing suggests she learnt Chopin from a tape in a bargain bin. Agatha winced. Even she found that cruel, and she had been unkind to pianists herself. Drury turned to Verity Lane. "And your column, my dear, remains the perfect cure for insomnia." Verity's hand tightened around her glass. Agatha clocked that. Motive 1. Then Drury moved toward Charles, who had gone slightly stiff. "Your house," Drury declared, "is tragically provincial, a museum of bland taste." Charles forced a smile. "Always a pleasure, Quentin." "Pleasure rarely enters into it," Drury replied. Within minutes, clusters of guests had formed cliques of mutual dislike. The Mercister couple whispered furiously to each other. The pianist dabbed her eyes. Verity scribbled notes with a vindictive flourish. Agatha felt the whole soirée sliding toward melodrama, and Charles, oblivious, seemed to think hosting this gaggle of half-hostile Londoners showed admirable sophistication. Agatha hovered near the French doors to grab a breath of night air. That was when she overheard the first useful snippet. Charles and Drury stood near the doorway to the hall, arguing in low but heated voices. "You know perfectly well it existed," Drury hissed. "You're imagining things," Charles replied. "Don't toy with me." Drury's tone cracked like a whip. "The portrait is somewhere, and I intend to have it." Agatha leaned closer, pretending to admire a vase. Charles's voice dropped. "I've told you, there is no portrait." Drury gave a contemptuous snort and stalked away. Charles ran a hand through his hair, looking genuinely troubled. Agatha felt her pulse quicken. A portrait, a secret, Charles lying. It all smelled of trouble, and she had an excellent nose for trouble, especially when Charles was involved. Dinner was announced at 8:30. The guests filed into the long dining room, where candles flickered along the polished table. Agatha took her seat and tried to steady herself. She wanted to look dignified, not flustered. Charles sat at the head, eyes faintly glazed. Drury sat opposite the pianist, who seemed one insult away from fainting. Verity positioned herself with a journalist's cunning halfway down the table, notebook at the ready. The Mercister couple glared at Drury with a level of loathing that could curdle the wine. Agatha watched everyone closely. Motives sprouted around the table like weeds. Drury had enemies everywhere, and not without reason. The first course arrived, oysters. Agatha eyed them suspiciously. They looked like they had been waiting in the kitchen for attention that never came. Polite conversation began. Verity asked Charles whether he intended to hold more soirées. Charles said he might, depending on financial flexibility. Agatha nearly choked on her water. Charles was wealthy enough to fund several small countries, but he always claimed poverty when it suited him. Drury interrupted. "If you wish to be taken seriously by the art world, Charles, you should consider acquiring pieces worth mentioning, not those vapid landscapes cluttering your hall." Charles's knuckles whitened around his fork. Agatha leaned in slightly. There it was again, Drury pushing the portrait subject, trying to unsettle Charles. She made a mental note. Charles's evasiveness earlier had not been mere vanity. The Mercister husband spoke up. "Some of us appreciate traditional pieces." Drury smirked. "Some of us lack taste." The wife stabbed a potato with unnecessary force. The pianist attempted small talk with Agatha, only to wilt as Drury threw her another glare. Agatha felt the poor woman's misery. Beneath her irritation she even mustered sympathy, a tiny amount. Dinner progressed with grim determination. Gossip grew sharp enough to slice the bread. Agatha caught whispers about failed exhibitions, unpaid debts, bitter reviews, ruinous columns, and something about a scandalous gallery show Drury had destroyed with one venomous article. Every conversation circled back to him, and every face bore resentment. Agatha sipped her wine, observing with the cool detachment of a woman who had once survived several WI committees. Everyone here had a reason to wish Drury harm. Everyone except perhaps Charles, though he too seemed cornered by something. The tension built until the air felt thick. Agatha tapped her foot under the table, half from nerves, half from anticipation. She sensed trouble brewing like a storm tucked behind the hills. At last, Drury lifted his glass again. "To our host," he said. "May his provincial charm improve with—" The lights flickered sharply. Several guests gasped. A murmur rolled down the table. Someone laughed nervously. Agatha inhaled, catching the faint scent of oysters that had definitely been out too long. "Oh dear," she murmured. "Something's about to go wrong." She was absolutely right. By the time the fish course arrived, the atmosphere had all the cheer of a funeral procession. Agatha Raisin, halfway down the long polished table, watched the atmosphere sag under the weight of forced civility. Candles flickered in the draught, throwing nervous shadows. Charles, seated at the head, wore the expression of a man desperately pretending to be in control. A thin sheen of sweat glistened across his brow, proof that hosting Londoners required unnatural effort. Agatha studied him with narrowed eyes. When Charles was relaxed, he looked insufferably smug. When troubled, he resembled a schoolboy caught hiding a slingshot. Tonight, he looked very much the latter. She glanced round the table. The pianist sat 2 seats away, pale and tense. The Mercester couple glowered at each other. Verity Lane wrote occasional notes in her tiny silver notebook, pausing only to observe Agatha with clinical amusement. Quentin Drury lounged in his chair like a man convinced he owned the room. Now the oysters had given way to the fish course, lemon sole, limp and suspiciously warm. Agatha prodded hers with the caution she usually reserved for WI quiches. Around her, guests attempted polite conversation, their voices brittle. Charles cleared his throat. "I do hope everyone is enjoying themselves." The words floated above the table and died somewhere near the bread rolls. Quentin Drury dabbed his mouth with his napkin. "You do try, Charles," he said loudly, "but one must accept limits. One cannot force refinement where none exists." Agatha felt the collective wince. The pianist murmured, "That's unkind." Drury gave her a glance sharp enough to slice tomatoes. "My dear, if you spent as much time at the piano as you do sulking, you might one day play without sounding like a nursery recorder." The poor woman shrank into her chair. Agatha's temper flared. If she'd been nearer, she might have accidentally spilled her wine on him. Conversation faltered again. The Mercester wife attempted to lighten things. "Perhaps we could have music after dinner." Drury snorted. "You appear determined to torture me." The husband's jaw tightened. Agatha noticed it. She also noticed Verity's eyebrow twitch with satisfaction. The columnist loved a public scene. Agatha took a sip of her wine and felt her detective instincts sharpen. It always happened when she was embarrassed or annoyed, and this evening provided both in abundance. Each guest radiated tension, malice, or exhaustion. Drury seemed to feed off it. The fish course progressed badly. The candles guttered. Someone knocked over a fork. Agatha had the uncomfortable impression the meal might simply collapse under its own discomfort. Then Drury decided to deliver a final flourish. He raised his glass. "To our host who has—" He stopped. His lips twitched oddly. For one peculiar second he looked astonished, as though someone had whispered an insult too outrageous to believe. Then his face contorted. His hand spasmed. The glass slipped, and he fell forward into his lemon sole with a loud, wet thump. For a moment the room froze. Then the screaming began. Guests shot to their feet. Chairs scraped. The pianist shrieked and bolted from the table. Verity Lane half stood, half crouched, scribbling furiously. The Mercester wife clutched her husband's arm. The husband looked ready to faint. Agatha leapt up so abruptly she knocked her chair sideways. In her haste she tripped on the carpet, caught herself on the edge of the table, and straightened with such dignity one might think she always performed near falls at dinner parties. Charles stared at Drury's motionless form, colour draining from his face. His mouth moved silently. Agatha leaned over the body, ignoring the outraged gasps. The smell hit her instantly. Bitter almonds. Her amateur detective encyclopedia opened in her brain like a smug dictionary. "Cyanide," she whispered, feeling knowledgeable and important. Bill Wong arrived 10 minutes later, summoned through frantic calls from the kitchen staff. He strode into the dining room with the calm of a man who had seen too many bodies and too many badly behaved dinner guests. His expression grew grimmer when he saw Agatha kneeling beside the corpse. "Agatha," he said, in a tone usually reserved for unruly pets. She stood briskly. "About time you got here, Bill. This man has been poisoned." "I can smell it," he replied. "Step back, please." But Agatha refused to be cowed. "Drury insulted everyone here. Half this table had reason to kill him." Bill gave her a weary look. "And you will let me investigate that." She lifted her chin in a gesture that implied nothing of the sort. Bill crouched over the body, inspected the face, then the wineglass still clutched in Drury's rigid hand. He sighed. "Definitely cyanide." Verity Lane materialized beside Agatha, speaking in a hushed but excited voice. "This will be quite the story." Agatha shot her a cold glare. "Someone has died." "Yes," Verity said lightly, "but he made so many enemies. It's practically poetic." "You're revolting," Agatha snapped. Verity smiled sweetly. "And you're fascinating, Miss Raisin. I might write about you." Agatha stiffened. She hoped Bill arrested someone soon, ideally Verity, even if innocent. Bill straightened. "No one is to leave." "The police will take statements." Charles staggered back against a sideboard. "Good heavens, my soirée is now a crime scene," Bill finished. Agatha watched Charles closely. He looked more shaken than she'd ever seen him. A glimmer of guilt flickered across his face, so brief she wondered whether she'd imagined it. She didn't imagine his evasive glance toward the hall. She had overheard his argument with Drury earlier. Charles had lied about the portrait, and now Drury was dead. A coincidence? She doubted it. Bill moved methodically through the room, asking brief questions. Agatha listened closely. The pianist confessed Drury had ruined her career with a scathing review. The Mercester couple admitted he had mocked their gallery publicly, costing them customers. Verity spoke breezily of professional rivalry. Every person in the room had motive. Agatha felt her excitement rising despite herself. Murder always sharpened her mind, made her feel alive, and guilty about feeling alive. She drifted toward Charles, who stood rubbing his forehead. "You look as if you're hiding something," she murmured. Charles jolted. "Don't be absurd." "You argued with him earlier." "Everyone argues with Quentin," he muttered. "The man could offend a saint." Agatha crossed her arms. What portrait was he talking about? Charles flushed a shade too quickly. "Drop it, Aggie." "Not likely." Before she could press further, Bill strode over. "Agatha." She gave him an innocent smile. "Yes?" "Stop interfering." "I am not interfering, I am observing. Please restrain yourself." "Of course," she lied. Bill sighed, the sigh of a man who had uttered that lie before. The guests were herded into the drawing room to await further questioning. They sank into armchairs with the shell-shocked weariness of stranded travellers. Charles hovered by the fireplace like a chastised schoolboy. Verity perched on a chaise longue, legs crossed elegantly, eyes alight with story-inflating possibilities. Agatha positioned herself near the drinks table, helping herself to a small measure of gin. Her pulse remained high, partly from the shock, partly from something sharper and more personal. Charles's suspicious vagueness nagged at her like a loose thread, and Verity's eager note-taking unsettled her. People who recorded tragedies with enthusiasm should be closely watched. Bill finally re-entered. "We'll need official statements tomorrow. For now, everyone may leave." Agatha set down her glass. "Bill, Agatha," she smiled brightly, "I won't interfere." Bill closed his eyes. "Yes, you will." He was absolutely right. Morning arrived in Carsley with a fog thick enough to hide sins, scandals, and most of the hedgerows. Agatha Raisin stepped out of her cottage with the purposeful stride of a woman wronged by the world and determined to interrogate it. Her breath puffed in the damp air, swirling like smoke from the cigarette she longed for but had vowed, for the 10th time this month, to reduce. Hodge watched from the window, tail twitching, clearly predicting failure. Agatha's temper flared with each step toward Charles Fraith's manor. She had hardly slept. The image of Quentin Drury slumped over his lemon soul replayed in her mind, between jolts of irritation at Charles's evasiveness. If he had answered her directly last night, she might not be out in this clammy muck before breakfast. The manor emerged from the fog like a sulky ghost. Agatha marched up the steps and hammered on the door. After a long pause, the trembling butler appeared, wearing an expression that implied the household was deeply fragile this morning. "Sir Charles is indisposed," he said. "Good," Agatha replied, sweeping past him. "He can be disposed for me." She found Charles in the morning room, wrapped in a robe, hair tousled, clutching a mug of black coffee with the desperation of a man clinging to civilization. "Aggie," he groaned, "for pity's sake. Don't you Aggie me." She planted herself in front of him. "A man died at your dinner table, and you—" Charles winced. He over-dramatized his demise. "He was poisoned, unless you think cyanide is a theatrical hobby." Charles rubbed his forehead. "Must you shout?" "I'm barely warming up." Charles sagged deeper into his chair. "Look, I didn't kill him. You know that." Agatha folded her arms. "I know nothing of the sort. What were you arguing about last night? And don't pretend it was about table settings." Charles hesitated. A fatal mistake. "It was nothing," he said too quickly. "Something he imagined." "He mentioned a portrait." Charles's eyes flickered. "There is no portrait." "You said that last night. You also said you hadn't meant to serve dangerous oysters." Charles scowled. "Those oysters were perfectly fine." "One of them winked at me," he sighed. "You're impossible." "And you're hiding something." Charles pushed himself upright with the weak determination of a hungover aristocrat. "Drury believed I owned a lost painting by some minor artist he championed years ago, an amateur who died tragically and thus became fashionable among people who enjoy suffering." "And do you own such a painting?" "No." It was the way he said it, a fraction too crisp, that made Agatha certain he was lying, but she would extract the truth later, preferably when he had a weaker defense than a mug of good coffee. "I'll be back," she said, "and I expect honesty." "You never expect honesty," he muttered. Agatha ignored him and stalked back into the fog, still fizzing with annoyance. The village shop sat warm and bright against the damp morning. Gossip moved thicker than the fog. Mrs. Mason, behind the counter, perked up the moment Agatha entered. "Terrible business," she said in a stage whisper. "That poor man at Sir Charles's soirée." "Poor is not the word I'd use," Agatha said. "He insulted half the county before keeling over." Mrs. Mason nodded eagerly. Verity Lane was in earlier, that fancy columnist. Asked whether Charles was short of money. Imagine, as if he'd ever admit to it. Agatha frowned. Why ask about his finances? Said she was working on a character sketch. Mrs. Mason's tone suggested character sketches and curses were interchangeable. Doris Simpson entered at that moment, bringing with her a gust of gossip. "Morning all. You'll never believe what I heard in Mercester. That glam couple at Charles's party, the husband and wife with faces like thunder. They were overheard gossiping about insurance values." "Insurance for what?" Agatha asked. "Paintings, I think," Doris said, very cagey about it, whispering away in the car park. Agatha filed it away. Motives were multiplying, and Charles's lie ticked louder in her mind. By the time she returned home, she had formed a new plan. She needed someone with both enthusiasm and complete disregard for propriety, someone who made Charles twitch. Roy Silver arrived an hour later in trousers so shiny they reflected the clouds. He flung open Agatha's gate with a flourish. "Darling Aggie," he cried, "I came as soon as I got your message. Murder, glamour, social disaster, you know I cannot resist." Agatha ushered him in. "Roy, I need help. Charles is lying about a portrait." Roy gasped. "A portrait of whom? Himself? I've always said he needed better lighting." "Not that kind. A painting Quentin Drury wanted, apparently valuable." Roy's eyes lit up. "Oh, Quentin Drury. He once destroyed a dealer's entire career by exposing a forged painting. A scandal in London. Absolutely vicious. Deliciously vicious." Agatha's intrigue sharpened. "So Drury had a taste for uncovering fraud?" "My dear, he savoured it. Artists, dealers, gallery owners, half of London wanted him throttled." Another motive, thought Agatha, and a wider circle of enemies. Roy perched on the arm of her sofa. "So what's our plan? Confront Charles until he crumbles?" "Not yet. First we find the portrait." "Do we know it exists?" Charles said no. Roy grinned. "Then it absolutely exists." With Roy in tow, they marched back to the manor. Charles, unfortunately, opened the door himself, looking like a man who regretted all his life choices. His eyes widened at the sight of Roy. "Oh, Lord," he murmured. "Why?" Roy fluttered his eyelashes. "Missed me?" "Not remotely." Agatha stepped inside. "We're here about the portrait." Charles groaned. There is no portrait. Then you won't mind us looking around? I absolutely mind. Agatha ignored him and strode into the hall. Charles followed, spluttering protests. Roy wandered off to inspect a vase with loud fascination. Agatha moved through the rooms with a predator's focus. The drawing room yielded nothing but dust and pretension. The study smelled faintly of cigar smoke and stubbornness. The small parlour contained a half-dead plant and a scattering of magazines. She circled back toward the kitchen when something caught her eye by the side door, a rubbish bin overflowing with bits of cardboard, a torn wine box and crumpled paper. Ordinarily uninteresting, except for a scrap of brown canvas peeking from beneath a newspaper. Agatha's pulse jumped. She reached in and tugged it free. The edge was rough, as if cut from a larger piece, the texture unmistakable, old canvas. A single brushstroke of dull green paint streaked across it. "What's that?" Roy asked, peering over her shoulder. Agatha held it up triumphantly. "A scrap of painting." Charles froze. "Aggie, put that back." "Why?" "Because it's rubbish." "Canvas isn't rubbish." Charles raked a hand through his hair. "It was from something unimportant." "Something you cut out of a frame?" "Aggie," he said in a warning tone, "leave it alone." But Agatha felt the thrill of discovery, a real clue, and a fresh reason to suspect Charles was keeping secrets that might tie directly to Quentin Drury's death. Roy whispered, "Darling, I believe we have drama." Agatha slipped the canvas scrap into her handbag. She gave Charles a cool, devastating look. "Lying never ends well." He flushed. "I'm not lying, I'm just omitting." "Omitting gets people killed." For once, Charles had no reply. Outside, the fog thickened again. Roy linked his arm through hers. "Where to next, detective?" Agatha breathed the damp air, sharp with purpose. "To find the rest of the painting," she said, "and whoever wanted it enough to kill." Hodge greeted her at home with a long, judgmental stare. She stroked his head, feeling a rare flicker of doubt. But doubt, like fog, would lift. The canvas scrap burned quietly in her handbag, a whisper of answers waiting to be uncovered. Carsley woke to the kind of drizzle that flattened hair, hope, and any chance of a peaceful day. Agatha Raisin stood at her garden gate, glaring at the grey sky as if it had personally insulted her. The village was already stirring with that peculiar energy that followed local scandal. Someone had died at Sir Charles Fraith's soirée, and Carsley was about to feast on it. Agatha felt both irritated and secretly pleased. There were worse things than being at the centre of gossip, and she had experienced most of them. Still, she dreaded the barrage of questions that waited for her beyond her own hedge. She lit a cigarette, inhaled deeply, and marched toward the shop. She made it 10 feet before Mrs. Kendrick descended upon her like a hawk spotting prey. "Mrs. Raisin, is it true Sir Charles dropped dead?" "No," Agatha snapped. "That was someone else." "Oh, shame," Mrs. Kendrick said briskly. "I never liked the look of him." "Which him?" Agatha demanded. "Either," Mrs. Kendrick replied, and marched on. At the shop, chaos reigned. Mrs. Mason stood behind the counter, serving customers with the calm of a battlefield nurse. Villagers crouched around the bakery shelf, trading rumours with the efficiency of a stock exchange. Agatha stepped inside and every head swiveled. "Is it true Charles poisoned him?" called Mr. Cummings-Brown, who had an unfortunate habit of looking delighted at tragedy. "Of course not," Agatha retorted. "Charles hasn't the initiative." Laughter rippled. She regretted the quip instantly. Now she'd fuel the rumour mill. But the truth was irresistible. People were hanging on her every word. It was mortifying and intoxicating. Doris Simpson popped up like a jack-in-the-box. "Agatha, I heard you were closest to the body. Did his face change colour? Someone said he turned purple, then green, then collapsed like a puppet." "He collapsed normally," Agatha said. "How boring," Doris sighed. The chatter rose until Mrs. Mason clapped her hands. "Stop pestering the poor woman. She's had a shock." Agatha basked in the attention a moment longer before retreating. She had work to do, investigative work, and could not waste the whole morning listening to creative versions of last night's disaster. At the Red Lion, the lunchtime rush had started early. Fred nodded her in. Agatha took her usual stool, scanning the room, and there, perched near the back like a smug crow, sat Verity Lane. Verity raised her glass. Mrs. Raisin, care to join me? Agatha hesitated, then strode over. If Verity had information, she wanted it. Quite the soirée, Verity said, crossing her legs with deliberate languor. Though I must say, murder adds a certain sparkle to an otherwise middlebrow affair. Someone died, Agatha snapped. Oh, I know. Tragic. Verity's tone indicated she meant the opposite. Still, it'll make a fascinating piece. I'm not above using poison metaphors in print. Agatha stiffened. You're writing about it? Naturally. Country society, secrets, envy. Delicious material. Leave Charles out of it, Agatha said sharply. Oh, I wouldn't dream of it. Verity's smile widened. Charles has his little secrets. Everyone does. Agatha leaned forward. What sort of secrets? Now, Verity said. A journalist never reveals sources. Agatha bit back a retort. Verity was thoroughly irritating, but irritating wasn't murderous. The woman was a red herring wrapped in glossy London arrogance. After 15 minutes of fencing with words, Agatha stood. Thank you. You've been no help whatsoever. My pleasure, Verity said sweetly. Outside, the drizzle sharpened. Agatha hunched her shoulders and headed down the lane toward Carsley's small bus shelter, where she'd arranged to meet the pianist from the party. She found the young woman, Lily Farnham, sitting on the bench clutching a dripping handkerchief. Miss Farnham, Agatha said gently. Lily nodded miserably. I'm sorry, I'm not usually like this. It's just, Quentin Drury destroyed my last audition, said my interpretation sounded like a cat treading on keys. Agatha offered her a tissue. He was vile to you last night. He always was, Lily sniffed. I wanted to pour wine over his head. I admit that, but I didn't poison anyone. Agatha watched her carefully. Where were you before dinner, when the wine was being decanted? Lily shook her head. I was performing at the King's Arms in Mercester. A standing gig. They'll vouch for me. A solid alibi, and the kind that left no room for poisoning. Agatha believed her. Lily's misery felt genuine, and her hands trembled with too much fear for guilt. Agatha walked her back toward the village centre, offering what comfort she could muster. She wasn't good at gentleness, but she managed a few encouraging words. Lily brightened a little. At the side path near the church, Agatha paused as Mrs. Bloxby appeared carrying 2 paper bags filled with parish newsletters. Mrs. Raisin, she said warmly, I hoped I might see you. You usually do, Agatha said. Mrs. Bloxby smiled. You've had a difficult evening. Everyone in Carsley wants to know whether Charles will be arrested, Agatha muttered. Half of them think he ought to be. Do you? Agatha hesitated. No, but there's something he's not telling me. He often keeps things close, Mrs. Bloxby said gently. Agatha wanted to press further, but stopped herself. Mrs. Bloxby always answered questions in riddles when she didn't wish to betray confidences. After leaving her, Agatha walked toward Charles's manor again. She felt compelled to revisit the scene, not the dining room itself, but the atmosphere. Murder left traces for her sharper instincts. In the kitchen, she found a young maid scrubbing the counter with excessive force. The girl froze when she saw Agatha. You're the lady who found the scrap of canvas, she whispered. Agatha blinked. News travels fast. The maid leaned closer. Sir Charles ordered all wine to be decanted before dinner, said it helped with presentation, but he left the room twice, once before the bell rang, once after. A chill ran through Agatha. Did anyone else go in? I didn't see, the maid said. I was polishing the silver. Agatha left with her heart hammering. If Charles had left the room twice, the timeline shifted. He could have tampered with a glass. She didn't want to believe it, but she had to follow the facts, not her affection, pride, or irritation. Back in the drizzle, she lit a cigarette and inhaled sharply. Charles could be foolish, careless, dishonest, but a murderer. Even she struggled to picture it. Still, the image of him lying about the portrait tightened something in her chest. As she walked toward home, she spotted Bill Wong's police car parked by the green. Bill stood beside it, speaking with the Mercester couple. They looked tense and defensive. Agatha edged closer, but Bill spotted her and raised a warning hand. She retreated before he could scold her. She didn't have the energy to argue. Arriving home, she found Hodge sitting in the middle of the hallway like a sphinx judging her moral failings. She bent to scratch his head. Don't look at me like that. I'm doing my best. He blinked, unimpressed. She made tea, though she wanted gin. The kettle hissed. Rain tapped the window. She allowed herself 5 minutes of quiet before the next round of villagers demanded answers. The knock came sooner than expected. Mrs. Blocksby stood on the doorstep, her face unusually serious. "May I come in?" she asked. Agatha nodded and led her to the sitting room. Mrs. Blocksby set her umbrella aside. "I thought you should know. Charles came to the vicarage late last night." Agatha's pulse jumped. "Why?" "He was shaken, very shaken. He kept saying he needed forgiveness." Agatha swallowed. "He said that?" "Yes," Mrs. Blocksby replied quietly, "but he wouldn't say what for." Agatha stared at the rain-streaked window. The room felt smaller. Charles had gone to the vicarage seeking forgiveness, after the murder. "What did he do?" Agatha whispered. Mrs. Blocksby laid a gentle hand on her arm. "That, dear, is what you must find out." And Agatha knew, with a tight, anxious certainty, that she absolutely would. Carsley woke under a sullen sky, the clouds coloured like old dishwater. Agatha Raisin stood at her kitchen sink, staring out at the damp garden while Hodge supervised from atop the bread bin. She felt the restless determination of a woman who had slept badly and blamed everyone but herself. "It's the portrait," she muttered. Hodge gave a slow blink that implied deep scepticism. Agatha tapped ash into a saucer. The scrap of canvas in her handbag had burned into her thoughts all night. Charles had lied about its existence, then tried to hide the evidence, badly, as usual. If the portrait had prompted Quentin Drury's fury, then it likely played a role in his death. Whether Charles was involved or merely incompetent remained to be seen. She needed answers, preferably quickly and discreetly. Which meant she needed Roy Silver back on the case. He turned up again at noon in a swirl of cologne and questionable fashion. "Darling Aggie, I've brought moral support, investigative brilliance, and trousers that could blind a small child." Agatha eyed the metallic blue fabric. "You're a menace." "I take that as affection," Roy said. Preening. They marched together toward Charles's manor. The fog had broken into a weak, watery sunlight that illuminated every floor in the gravel drive. Agatha strode forward with brisk intent. Roy sauntered like a man entering a cocktail party. "Remember the plan," Agatha said sternly. Roy fluttered his lashes. "Flirting, distraction, chaos. My strengths." Charles answered the door himself. He looked suspicious instantly. "Oh no, not both of you." Agatha swept past him. "We're here to talk." Roy leaned in. "About art, darling." Charles recoiled. "No." But Roy had already spotted the housekeeper dusting a porcelain figurine in the hall. He approached with theatrical charm. "My dear woman, you can't possibly appreciate how your complexion glows in this lighting." The housekeeper, unused to such direct assault, flushed bright pink. "Sir, please." Roy launched into an enthusiastic monologue about French decorative technique, whatever that was. Agatha seized the moment and slipped down the corridor toward Charles's study. The door creaked slightly, but the sound was swallowed by Roy's booming analysis of 18th century glazes. Inside, the study smelled faintly of pipe smoke and gilt. Books lined the walls, though most appeared unread. The desk was in typical Charles disarray. Half-empty glasses, letters partially opened, notes with undecipherable scrawl. Agatha pulled on gloves. She wasn't entirely sure why. They made her feel professional. She opened drawers, checked cupboards, nudged aside stacks of stamps and unpaid bills. Nothing significant surfaced until she found the bottom right drawer locked. "Of course," she murmured. Charles hid things like a child hiding sweets from a sibling, badly, but with confidence. She rummaged for something thin enough to pick the lock. An old letter opener did the trick. After a few tense seconds, the drawer clicked. Inside lay a stack of envelopes tied with string, a small wooden box, and, most importantly, a single folded letter addressed to Charles in Quentin Drury's spidery hand. Agatha unfolded it quickly. The letter was dated 2 days before the soirée. "Fraith, you cannot conceal the portrait indefinitely. Its value demands proper appraisal. Your attempts to avoid inheritance tax by hiding it are transparent. I will obtain it one way or another. Drury." Agatha felt her pulse jump. This was more than harmless bickering. Drury openly accused Charles of tax evasion, something even Charles wouldn't treat lightly. Her mind spun. Did Charles kill Drury to silence him? Did he panic? Did he fear scandal? But then a thought tightened in her mind. The letter's date, 2 days before the party. The timeline felt off, too theatrical, too convenient. Something strained at the edges of the logic. She tucked the letter into her coat pocket and checked the wooden box. Inside lay a collection of old keys, foreign coins, cufflinks, and an empty envelope addressed to a solicitor. Nothing obviously connected to a painting. Agatha turned toward the fireplace. Ash filled the grate and fragments of blackened debris clung to the interior. She crouched, inspecting the residue more closely. Among the ash lay strands of something fibrous. She pinched one carefully. Canvas fibre. More confirmation. Charles had burned part of the painting. But why only part? Why leave a scrap in the rubbish bin? Unless he had been interrupted, or unsure, or regretted destroying it entirely. Behind her, footsteps approached. Agatha stuffed the canvas fibres back into the grate just before Charles entered. His expression swung from confusion to dismay. "What are you doing in here?" he demanded. "Looking for the truth," Agatha replied. Charles ran a hand through his hair. "Roy is terrorizing my housekeeper." "She likes the attention," Agatha said, though she wasn't certain. "Aggie, this is intrusive." "You lied to me. About the portrait, about everything." He opened his mouth, closed it, and then opened it again in a defeated sigh. "All right, fine. The portrait existed, briefly." Agatha folded her arms. And it wasn't valuable. "Then why burn it?" Charles stiffened. "Because it was ugly." "Ugly?" "Hideous. My mother commissioned it before I was born." He grimaced. "The artist painted her with a jaw like a collapsed pudding." Agatha let out a small snort before catching herself. "It hung in the attic for years," Charles continued. "Drury heard of it somehow and insisted it was a lost piece from a tragically misunderstood painter. Complete rubbish." "So, you burned it?" "Yes, to spare my mother's memory from Drury's prying." Agatha studied him carefully. It sounded true, yet Charles was evasive enough that truth and performance often intertwined. "And the letter?" she said, pulling it out. Charles's eyes widened. "Agatha, you had no right. He accused you of hiding the portrait to avoid inheritance tax." Charles scoffed. Drury was a drama queen. He'd accuse a teapot of treason if it sold copies of his memoir. "That's not an answer." "I burned the portrait because it was ugly," Charles repeated, "not because of money or value or scandal." His voice sharpened with rare indignation. "And I did not poison the man, no matter how aggravating he was." Agatha hesitated. Charles looked genuinely wounded, but she also saw the flicker of defiance that meant he still wasn't telling her everything. "You should have told Bill," she said. "Now it looks suspicious." "Everything I do looks suspicious," Charles replied. "It's the curse of being interesting." "You're not interesting," Agatha retorted. "You're infuriating." "Better than dull." He stormed out, robe flapping with aristocratic offence. Agatha followed him into the hall, only to find Roy leaning against the banister looking pleased with himself. "Well?" he asked. "He burned the portrait," Agatha said. Roy gasped. "Tragic. Was it valuable?" "He claims not." "Do we believe him?" Agatha paused. "Not entirely." Roy nodded. "Good. Mystery thrives on distrust." They left the manor, stepping into the crisp afternoon air. Agatha felt both energized and worn. The canvas scrap pressed sharply in her handbag, a reminder of how far the truth remained. They reached her gate just as Bill Wong's police car pulled up beside the lane. Bill got out wearing his usual expression of weary patience. "Agatha," he said. "Roy." Roy saluted theatrically. Bill did not smile. "I've come with toxicology results," Bill said, stepping closer. "Cyanide was found in Quentin Drury's glass." "Yes, we knew that," Agatha said. Bill shook his head. "There was no cyanide in the decanter, only in the glass. It wasn't random poisoning. The killer targeted Drury specifically." Agatha's breath caught. "Which means," Bill continued, "someone at that table watched him raise his glass, and made sure it was the only fatal one." Agatha felt a cold, thrilling certainty. The portrait wasn't the whole story. Someone hadn't just wanted Drury dead. Someone had wanted Agatha, and everyone else, to watch. And she intended to find out who. A brittle spring wind rattled through Castley, flicking old leaves along the pavements like gossip notes delivered too late. Agatha Raisin stood outside her cottage with a cigarette half lit, wrestling the lighter against the breeze. She felt the uneasy prickle of someone missing a piece of a puzzle and hating the indignity of ignorance. "The poisoner knew the seating," she muttered. Hodge, inspecting a patch of weeds near the step, ignored her. She lit her cigarette triumphantly and marched down the lane. If the killer had targeted Drury alone, they needed to know precisely where he would sit, which meant someone with foreknowledge, or someone who paid very close attention. Her first stop was the Red Lion. Fred had just wiped down the bar when she entered. At the corner table sat Verity Lane, sipping something small and fashionable, looking as if she were posing for her own column. Agatha approached with brisk disdain. "I need a word." Verity looked up with soft mockery. "Always a pleasure, Mrs. Raisin. Sit." Agatha remained standing. "You took photographs before dinner." "Of course. Research. Atmosphere. Fleeting impressions." "Show me." Verity sighed theatrically and produced her small camera from her bag. "You're lucky I haven't had these developed yet." She flicked through the prints, pulling out several. "Here, pre-dinner snapshots." Agatha examined the images. The dining room gleamed with candlelight. Charles looked strained but decorative. The Mercester couple stood near a side table. Drury, unmistakable in his smug arrogance, sat beside the Mercester husband. "He wasn't sitting by him later," Agatha said. "They swapped seats," Verity replied lightly. "I assumed it was because Mrs. Mercester wanted the better angle for conversation." "Or someone didn't want Drury in striking distance of someone else," Agatha murmured. Verity raised an eyebrow. "Be careful with your theories. They'll get you into trouble." "Everything gets me into trouble," Agatha replied, pocketing the photo. Verity leaned back. "For what it's worth, I saw nothing sinister. Just smugness, boredom, and bad seating arrangements." "You see everything as material." "Naturally." Agatha left before Verity could offer more insults disguised as insights. She had a new destination, the Mercester couple's gallery. Mercester's high street bustled with late-morning shoppers. Agatha marched through the crowd, ignoring a waiter who nearly collided with her. The gallery sat between a chemist and a charity shop, its window filled with abstract shapes that looked like arguments frozen in paint. Inside, the Mercester couple hovered anxiously behind the counter. "Mrs. Raisin," the wife said coolly, "we were expecting the police, not you." "I'm quicker than the police," Agatha replied, "and I ask better questions." The husband frowned. "We've answered everything already. Quentin Drury destroyed our last exhibition, publicly humiliated us. We hated him, yes, but we didn't kill him." Agatha circled the gallery, observing. "Tell me about the portrait he wanted from Charles." The wife folded her arms. "A minor painter. Drury adored tragic obscurity. He said the portrait could be worth money if properly authenticated." "And you two wanted in on the valuation?" Agatha asked. The husband flushed. "We approached Sir Charles weeks ago. He claimed he didn't own the thing." Agatha's irritation twitched. Charles had been lying to everyone, not just her. "Where were you before dinner?" Agatha demanded. The wife bristled. "Arguing with one another in the garden. Half the guests saw us. We missed the wine being poured." Agatha studied their faces. Both looked offended, defensive, exhausted, genuine or well-rehearsed. As she turned, something caught her eye. A pair of gloves on a nearby table. Pale fabric streaked with a faint yellowish tint. She picked them up. "What's this?" The husband swiped them quickly. "Varnish. We restored a piece last week." "Varnish?" Agatha repeated. "Yes," the wife said sharply. "You know nothing about materials." "True," Agatha replied, "but I know when someone's lying." They exchanged a glance, not guilt, but irritation. She filed it away. Outside, she walked briskly back toward Carsley, the wind chasing her coat. The gloves gnawed at her mind. Varnish came in shades and scents, and some restoration chemicals masked the odour of less pleasant substances. Her thoughts churned so loudly she nearly missed Charles leaning against her garden gate when she returned. He looked peculiarly subdued, hands in pockets, face unusually earnest. "Aggie," he began, "if you've come to lie to me again—" He lifted a hand. "I owe you honesty." Agatha froze. Charles apologizing voluntarily was as natural as snow in August. He stepped closer, voice lower. "About the portrait. You deserve to know the truth." She crossed her arms but didn't interrupt. Charles exhaled. "It wasn't valuable, truly, not in any monetary sense." Then why burn it? Because it embarrassed me, he said quietly. It was a portrait of my mother. The artist captured every imperfection, the wrong angle, the harsh jawline, the sorrow she never admitted. Drury found out and threatened to publish it in a memoir. Agatha softened despite herself. Why? To humiliate me, Charles said. He collected people's weak spots the way others collect stamps. Agatha felt her annoyance wobble. She knew shame too well. The bruised ego, the desperate need to hide one's vulnerabilities. So you burned it, she said. Yes, not to hide value, to protect her. Agatha studied him. He looked sincere and miserable. She sighed. I believe you. Charles blinked. You do? Reluctantly. Well, he said, recovering his usual charm, that's the closest thing to affection you've offered all week. Before she could reply, the gate flew open and Roy burst in, coat flapping like a startled heron. Aggie! Charles! Emergency! What now? Agatha demanded. Roy waved a newspaper. It's Verity Lane. She's gone. Agatha stiffened. Gone where? No idea, Roy said breathlessly. Her hotel says she checked out early this morning and vanished. Left the bill unpaid. Charles muttered. Typical. But Agatha felt the cold spark of trouble. Verity Lane didn't strike her as a woman who ran from anything, especially gossip. If Verity had disappeared, it meant she'd found something, or someone had made sure she wouldn't talk. Agatha stepped toward the lane, cigarette trembling faintly in her fingers. Well, Roy demanded, what do we do? She flicked ash into the wind. We find her. Roy looked delighted. Charles looked horrified. Agatha's pulse quickened with that familiar, dangerous thrill. Secrets were unraveling, motives sharpening, and Verity Lane, irritating, smug, nosy Verity, had vanished just when the truth crept closest. She knows something, Agatha murmured, and whoever doesn't want it revealed knows where she is. Or where she isn't, Roy added dramatically. Agatha shot him a glare. Not helpful. Charles rubbed his temples. Can't Bill handle this? Agatha ignored him. No, this is connected. Verity took photographs. She saw people shifting seats. She saw Drury antagonizing half the room. She saw something else, something she didn't tell me. She strode toward her cottage door. Hodge sat in the window, eyeing the commotion with the disdain of a creature above human melodrama. Agatha squared her shoulders. We start in Mercester, she said. Her hotel, her contacts, her last steps. Roy saluted. To battle, Charles muttered. To misery. Agatha smiled grimly. To the truth. Inside, she grabbed her coat, handbag, and lighter. Some secrets were buried in portraits, others hid behind gallery walls, but Verity Lane had hidden hers in plain sight, in photographs, glances, and unfinished sentences, and someone wanted that trail cold. As Agatha stepped into the stiff spring wind, she felt the case shift beneath her feet, a quiet, dangerous turning. Castley, with its drizzle and gossip, watched her go, and far too many people hoped she wouldn't find what she was looking for. The morning broke with a sulky drizzle that clung to the hedgerows like gossip afraid to go home. Agatha Raisin stood at her front door, clutching a damp scarf and wishing she had the sense to stay inside. But Verity Lane had vanished. The case was twisting into knots, and Agatha would rather face wild boars than let a London columnist upstage her. Roy and Charles waited at the gate, both looking as though they regretted agreeing to help. Charles leaned against his vintage convertible, arms folded in aristocratic misery. Roy, bright and dramatic in a burgundy coat, bounced impatiently on the spot. Right, Agatha said. The hotel in Mercester said she walked out toward the lane for Ankham Wood, so we start at the footpath leading into it. Why would she wander into a wood? Charles muttered. Because she's nosy, Agatha replied, and nosy people rarely choose safe locations. Roy raised a finger. Present company excluded, of course. Shut up, Roy. They trudged along the muddy footpath, drizzle thickening to an annoying mist. The branches dripped steadily, creating a rhythm of soggy misery. Agatha marched with purpose, ignoring the splashes on her shoes. She had a journalist to find and a murderer to expose. Half a mile in, they heard a noise, a rustle, a short cry, then silence. Agatha froze. Did you hear that? Roy clutched her sleeve. Aggie, if this is a murderer. Then he'll regret choosing the wrong victim, she snapped. They advanced cautiously toward a thicket of hawthorn. Agatha pushed aside branches and found Verity Lane crouched behind a fallen trunk, hair wild, coat smeared with mud, eyes wide with fear. "Verity!" Agatha exclaimed. "What on earth are you doing down there?" Verity lifted her head like a startled woodland creature. "Someone chased me," she whispered. "I've been hiding for hours." Charles sighed. "Trust you to choose the most inconvenient place." Agatha helped Verity up. The woman trembled violently. Her fashionable shoes were ruined, which Agatha suspected upset her more than near death. "Who chased you?" Agatha demanded. Verity swallowed. "I don't know. I heard footsteps behind me last night, just after I found—" She stopped abruptly. Roy leaned forward. "Found what?" Verity's lips pressed together. "Something awful." Agatha stomped her foot. "For heaven's sake, Verity, this is not the moment to be mysterious." "I'll tell Mrs. Bloxby," Verity said weakly. "Not you." Agatha glared. "Why her?" "Because she's kind." Charles coughed. Roy snorted. Agatha looked ready to strangle her. But there was no time. Verity looked close to collapse, and Agatha knew Mrs. Bloxby's calm presence might coax out the truth faster than threats. They led Verity back to Castley through the drizzle. Charles grumbled the whole way. Roy offered theatrical reassurances. Agatha tried to maintain patience and failed often. At the vicarage, Mrs. Bloxby welcomed them with warm tea, soft cushions, and the sort of kindness that made Verity visibly melt. Within minutes, the columnist sat sipping delicately, wrapped in a borrowed shawl. Mrs. Bloxby patted her hand. "Now, my dear, you've had a shock. Tell us what frightened you." Verity's eyes darted to Agatha. "Promise you won't interrupt." "I'm not making promises," Agatha said. Mrs. Bloxby gave her a steady look. Agatha sighed. "Fine, I'll behave." Verity took a breath. "After Sir Charles's dinner, I went exploring. I wanted more details for my article. I ended up in the wine cellar." "Why?" Charles spluttered. "I like atmosphere," Verity replied. Agatha muttered something unprintable. Verity continued. "While I was down there, I found something awful." Mrs. Bloxby nodded gently. "Take your time." Verity lowered her voice. "I saw one of the guests in the cellar. They poured something from a small bottle into a single glass, not the decanter." Agatha's heart thumped. "I thought nothing of it at first," Verity said. "I assumed they were sneaking extra wine. Then I noticed 2 wine glasses on the counter. One had a faint smell. Bitter. Unusual." "Cyanide," Agatha whispered. "Perhaps." Then the guest picked up the glass and swapped it with another one on a tray. The room tightened around them. "You saw the poisoner?" Agatha cried. Verity nodded. "Who was it?" Verity hesitated. "I can't say yet." Agatha shot to her feet. "What?" "It's too important. If I tell now, someone else will get the story. I want a publishing deal first." Agatha stared at her in disbelief. "A man is dead, and you're negotiating headline rights?" Verity sniffed. "Journalism isn't a hobby." Agatha, for one terrifying second, considered launching herself across the vicarage tea table. Mrs. Bloxby intervened with a calm voice. "Verity." "Dear, this is dangerous information." "I know. That's why someone chased me," Verity said. "They must have seen me in the cellar." Before Agatha could respond, there was a knock at the door. Bill Wong stepped inside, concern etched on his face. "We've been looking for you, Miss Lane." Agatha groaned. "Bill, not now. She was just—" "I have to take her into protective custody," Bill interrupted. "She's a material witness." Verity stood shakily. "See? Even the police admit I'm important." Agatha felt a scream building. Bill, oblivious to her inner carnage, guided Verity toward the door. "Wait!" Agatha grabbed Verity's arm. "Just tell me who you saw." "Soon," Verity said smugly. "Once the contract is signed." Agatha released her before she did something regrettable. Bill shepherded Verity outside and into the police car. Agatha turned furiously toward Mrs. Bloxby. "Can you believe that woman?" Mrs. Bloxby smiled faintly. "She is ambitious." "She's insufferable," Agatha snapped. Roy entered from the hall, panting. "Aggie, she dropped something." He held up a small notebook. Agatha snatched it. Inside were scribbles, half-formed phrases, interview notes, and dramatic headlines. But one phrase appeared several times, circled in thick pen. "Insurance fraud." Agatha's eyebrow twitched. Insurance fraud, of course, Roy gasped. Oh, the Mercester couple. They talked about insurance values, Agatha said, but would they commit murder? Anyone might, Roy replied dramatically. Agatha flipped through more pages. A line in Verity's handwriting read, check value of gallery. Another, threatened losses. A third, who benefits if Drury dies? Agatha felt the slippery weight of suspicion shift again. Charles, who had been leaning glumly against the vicarage doorway, straightened. This is absurd. You can't suspect everyone. I can, and I do, Agatha retorted. Even me? Charles asked quietly. Agatha paused. She felt heat creep up her neck. She had, in fact, spent half the morning suspecting him again. His evasiveness irritated her, his secrets unnerved her, and his charm clouded her judgment. Your life insurance is pathetic, she muttered. Hardly enough motive. How comforting, Charles said dryly. Agatha paced the vicarage sitting room. It's the gloves, the varnish, the swapped seats. Someone had reason to kill Drury, reason to frame Charles, reason to silence Verity. Or, Charles said, Verity misinterpreted something. She misinterprets fashion choices, Agatha said, not attempted murder. Mrs. Bloxby watched them fondly. You seem tired, Agatha. I'm tired of deceit. No, Mrs. Bloxby said gently. You're worried. Agatha bristled. About what? The vicar's wife simply smiled. Agatha hated how accurately that woman read her. They left the vicarage as the drizzle returned. Back at her cottage, Agatha waved Charles and Roy away with a brusque promise to telephone them. She needed quiet. She needed clarity. Inside, she threw her coat onto a chair. Hodge stretched on the sofa with a leisurely disdain that implied he had solved the case already. You're impossible, Agatha muttered, lighting a cigarette. She paced the sitting room. Insurance, gallery, varnish, seats swapped, Verity vanishing, someone chasing her. Her mind whirled until she noticed something on the floor, a small envelope, recently pushed under the door. She picked it up, the paper slightly damp, the handwriting jagged and hurried. She opened it. One line. You're next. Stop digging. Agatha let out a short, incredulous laugh. Over my dead body. Hodge blinked reproachfully, unconvinced either way. Agatha exhaled a long plume of smoke. The case had turned dangerous. Good. She did her best work when the stakes rose, even if she claimed otherwise. She tucked the note into her pocket. Someone wanted her frightened. They had clearly never met Agatha Raisin. Carsley glistened under a soft evening drizzle, the kind that coated hedges and cottage windows with a film of silver. Agatha Raisin stood at her sitting-room window, arms crossed, cigarette dangling from one hand. The village was nearly quiet now that the Mercester couple had been carted off in Bill Wong's police car. One would think triumph would taste sweeter. Instead, Agatha felt an irritating knot just under her ribs, the sort of knot that meant Charles Fraith had been evasive again. He hadn't thanked her. Not properly. A nod, a mumbled, well done, Aggie. Then he'd vanished back to his manor as though murder, blackmail, and an attempted framing of himself were a mildly inconvenient draught from the window. Agatha flicked ash sharply. Coward, she muttered. Ungrateful aristocratic weasel. Hodge blinked from the sofa with judgmental calm. She grabbed her coat, stepped into the drizzle, and marched down the lane. The air smelled of wet earth and stubborn secrets. Light shone from Charles's manor windows. He was awake then. Good. She would drag the truth out of him like a tick from a terrier. She hammered on the front door. After a moment, Charles opened it, wearing an expression halfway between guilt and irritation. Aggie, he said flatly. Must you? Yes, she replied, pushing past him. I must. He shut the door with resigned dignity. You storm in as though you own the place. If I did, I'd redecorate, she snapped. Where have you been all day? Bill arrested the real killers and you behaved like a man avoiding his own birthday. Charles rubbed his temples. I've had a trying afternoon. Oh, poor you, Agatha said. Someone else murdered, someone else arrested, someone else blackmailed. How exhausting for you personally. Charles glanced toward the study. It's not that. Agatha folded her arms. Then what? He hesitated, which in Agatha's experience meant he was either about to lie or confess something uncomfortable. She marched into the study and planted herself in the armchair. Start talking. Charles entered slowly, closing the door behind him. Something in his eyes shifted, not his usual flippant sparkle, but something older, heavier. "Aggie, I wasn't entirely honest before. I assumed as much." "About the portrait," he said softly. Agatha sat upright. "What now? Was it secretly painted by Rembrandt? Was your mother secretly three-headed?" He gave a weak laugh. Then it faded. It wasn't merely unflattering. It revealed something private. Agatha didn't move. Charles paced once, hands in his pockets. "My mother had a love affair before she married my father. A foolish romance with a travelling musician. Drury discovered the portrait years ago. The artist captured more than her likeness. He captured the resemblance to the man she almost married. Drury realized the significance instantly." "And he used it against you," Agatha said quietly. "For years," Charles admitted. "Every so often he'd write reminding me he held proof that my father might not have been my father at all. Nothing ever resolved, nothing confirmed. Just implication. Enough to stir scandal. Enough to rattle me." Agatha's irritation softened. She knew what it felt like to fear judgment, to fear ridicule even more. "I burned the portrait," Charles said, sitting opposite her. "Not because it was ugly, because I was tired of being held hostage by a man who loved other people's pain." Agatha's voice gentled without her permission. "You should have told me." "It's ghastly being sincere," Charles said, attempting a smile. She snorted. "You're terrible at it." "I know," he said. "I prefer flippancy." "You hide behind it," she replied. "Yes," he said, "and you hide behind sarcasm." She bristled. "I do not." "You do." His smile warmed. "It's one of your charms." She looked away too quickly. The silence that followed was not their usual argumentative one. It was hesitant, thick with something like understanding. Agatha hated it. It left her exposed. "Well," she said briskly, standing, "you might at least thank me for solving your murder problem." "I did thank you." "Not properly." He leaned back, regarding her with maddening fondness. "Aggie, if I thank you too sincerely, you'll think I'm dying." "You might be if you keep avoiding me," she retorted. He laughed then, a warm, genuine sound. For a moment, she saw something vulnerable and sweet beneath the aristocratic indifference. It unsettled her more than any murderer. But before she could pursue the conversation further, there was a sharp knock at the manor door. Charles frowned. "At this hour?" Agatha followed him into the hall. He opened the door to reveal a breathless Roy Silver holding a newspaper triumphantly. "Aggie, it's out!" Roy squealed. "Verity Lane sold her article." Agatha's stomach dropped. "Already?" Roy shoved the paper into her hands. "Page 7. Read the headline." Agatha unfolded the newspaper, dread curling like smoke. The headline screamed, "Cotswold Chaos. Amateur busybody upstages police at fatal soirée." Agatha's jaw dropped. "Busybody?" Roy read over her shoulder. "Interfering busybody, actually." "Oh, that woman," Agatha hissed. "I'll throttle her with her own typewriter ribbon." Charles tried not to smile. "Aggie, it's not that bad." She said, "I blustered about Castley like a detective in a discount novel." Agatha jabbed the page. She said, "I interrupted official procedure with unnecessary flair." "Unnecessary flair?" Roy fanned her dramatically. "You do have flair." "That's not the point," Agatha snapped. "The point is she made me sound incompetent." "She isn't entirely wrong," Charles murmured. Agatha spun on him. "I saved you from being arrested." "Yes," Charles said gently, "and I'm grateful." She froze. "You are?" "Terribly," he said. "Even if the newspaper thinks you're meddlesome." Agatha folded the paper sharply. "I'll deal with Verity later, preferably with Nettles." Roy clapped his hands. "Speaking of later, Charles, aren't you forgetting something?" Charles blinked. "Am I?" Roy elbowed him not so subtly. "The invitation." Charles coloured slightly. "Oh, yes. Aggie, would you join me for dinner tonight? Alone?" Agatha blinked at him, stunned. Roy looked like he might combust from excitement. "Dinner?" she echoed. "Yes," Charles said lightly. "Proper dinner. Well, something I'm capable of producing. My cook walked out this afternoon." "Why?" Agatha demanded. Charles sighed. "She said she refused to work in a house associated with murder. Very unreasonable. Agatha studied him, suspicion wrestling with something softer. "All right," she said, "but if you serve me cold beans on toast, I'll poison you, with style." Roy clapped as though a proposal had just occurred. "Marvellous. Romance is alive." "Shut up, Roy," Agatha and Charles said in unison. Agatha returned to her cottage in a whirl of adrenaline and irritation. Hodge greeted her from atop the radiator cover with a disdainful yawn. "Don't start," she told him. She marched upstairs and flung open her wardrobe. She spent the next hour selecting an outfit. First the green dress, too clingy, then the plum one, too funereal, then the navy skirt, too businesslike, then a soft grey number that felt vaguely sophisticated. She applied lipstick twice, red, then coral. She changed earrings 3 times. She muttered at her reflection like a woman preparing for battle rather than dinner. "It's not a date," she told herself. "It's an apology. An apology dinner. Entirely different." Hodge watched from the doorway, tail flicking, unimpressed with human nonsense. Finally ready, Agatha stepped into the drizzle again and walked toward Charles's manor under the fading light. Her stomach fluttered. She blamed hunger. Charles greeted her at the door wearing a shirt only slightly wrinkled and a nervous expression. "Come in," he said. "I've done my best." Agatha entered the dining room and laughed. A single candle flickered in the centre of the table, 2 bowls, a tin opener, and a saucepan containing tomato soup that looked suspiciously shop-bought. "This is your best?" she teased. Charles threw up his hands. "My culinary repertoire is limited. The cook abandoned me. I attempted to roast something, but the smoke alarm wouldn't stop." She snorted. "You're hopeless." "Yes," he admitted, "but I invited you anyway." Agatha softened. "It'll do." They sat, shared soup, bread, and a bottle of surprisingly decent wine. The atmosphere eased. They bickered, teased, drifted into comfortable silence. No drama, no police, no murder suspects. Just 2 people awkwardly navigating something tender. At one point, Charles said, "I'm sorry for dragging you into another mess." Agatha lifted an eyebrow. "You didn't drag me. I leapt," he smiled. "You always do." "Someone has to keep you alive," she replied. "Do you plan to continue?" His tone was half teasing, half hopeful. "For now," she said with the studied casualness. He poured more wine. She didn't refuse it. Later, Agatha walked home through quiet Carsley, the night washed clean by rain. Her coat smelled faintly of smoke from Charles's disastrous cooking attempt. She carried the newspaper under her arm, folded so the headline didn't glare at her. Inside the cottage, Hodge sat on the sofa like a furry emperor awaiting tribute. Agatha sank beside him with a sigh. "Don't judge me," she said. "It was only soup." Hodge stretched, turned once, then climbed into her lap, the first affectionate gesture he'd offered all week. He settled heavily, warmth radiating through her coat. Agatha smiled despite herself. The murder solved, the truth aired. Charles, behaving oddly like a real friend, and a cat on her lap. For Carsley, it was practically bliss. She lit a cigarette, leaned back and whispered, "Order restored, more or less." Hodge purred in agreement, or mild contempt. With him, it was always hard to tell. A week later, Carsley had returned to its usual rhythms, the soft hum of gossip drifting from the shop, the muted thump of the WI hall door, the steady drizzle that coated everything except village enthusiasm. Agatha Raisin, however, enjoyed the rare pleasure of being the star of the local rumour mill. She pretended to dislike the attention, of course, though her brisk walk through the village betrayed an unmistakable spring of satisfaction. At the Red Lion, the lunchtime crowd buzzed with familiar warmth. Fred nodded her toward the corner table, where Bill Wong sat with a pint and the weary expression of a man resigned to public admiration aimed at someone else. Roy Silver lounged beside him, already halfway through a packet of crisps. Agatha slid onto the bench. "I assume you're both here to worship me." Bill sighed. "I'm here to eat." Roy beamed. "I'm here to admire genius, darling." Agatha smirked. "Correct answer." Bill set his pint down. "Murder cases are not competitions." "They are if I win," Agatha replied. "Which I did." Bill rubbed his forehead. "You interfered in every stage of the investigation." "Improved," Roy said brightly. "She improved every stage." Bill ignored him. "But you were right. About the murderers. About the portrait. About the motive. So..." He took a reluctant breath. Well done. Agatha straightened. Say it once more, with feeling. No, Bill replied. Roy leaned closer. Bill, she's been unbearable all week. Give her this. Bill drained half his pint. Fine. You did well, Agatha. She nodded graciously. Thank you. I'll try to remain humble. Roy laughed so loudly half the pub turned. Oh, darling, try very hard. Agatha swatted his hand. Speaking of trying, what's this I hear about you planning some kind of Agatha Raisin mystery tour? Roy clasped his hands dramatically. Imagine it. Fans following in your footsteps. The sights of your triumphs. Posters, badges, exclusive merchandise. I'll kill you, Agatha said calmly. But think of the publicity. I'll kill you twice. Bill hid a smile behind his glass. Carsley, Agatha thought smugly, was back to normal. The pub door opened with a jingle, and Mrs. Bloxby stepped inside, removing her rain-spotted coat. She approached with her usual serene warmth. Mrs. Raisin, I hear congratulations are in order. Not from you as well, Agatha groaned, though secretly she was delighted. Mrs. Bloxby sat beside her. You solved a painful business, and you seem lighter. Agatha blinked. Lighter? I've lost no weight. I meant less cross, Mrs. Bloxby said gently, particularly when Sir Charles's name is mentioned. Agatha's eyes narrowed. I don't know what you're implying. Nothing, dear, Mrs. Bloxby said, sipping her tea. Only an observation. Well, stop observing, Agatha snapped, feeling heat rise in her cheeks. Roy kicked Bill under the table and mouthed, Told you. Bill rolled his eyes. Agatha pushed back from the table. I need air. But the air followed her to the lane, damp, cool, and filled with the faint scent of cow parsley and scandal long faded. She walked home briskly, muttering about soft-voiced vicars' wives who saw too much. She had just stepped onto her garden path when a familiar voice called behind her. Charles Fraith strode up with his hands in his coat pockets and a scarf draped neatly over his arm. You left this at my place, he said. Agatha snatched the scarf. I was wondering where that had gone. I thought you might accuse me of stealing it, Charles said lightly, so I returned it before you launched an investigation. Ha, ha. He looked at her with that infuriating half-smile. You solved the case rather brilliantly, obviously. And, he continued, I owe you more than soup. Agatha sniffed. Everyone owes me more than soup, he chuckled. I may avoid hosting soirees for the foreseeable future. They seem to end badly. You? Agatha scoffed. Avoid attention. You'll fail spectacularly. Possibly, he said, still smiling, but at least I'll fail with style. Or scandal, she replied. He bowed slightly, the gesture just shy of mockery. Until next time, Aggie. Agatha watched him walk away, feeling an inconvenient warmth spread through her chest. She would deny it, of course. Denial was one of her strengths. Inside her cottage, the evening light spilled across the sitting room. Agatha hung up her coat, fed Hodge, and poured herself a sensible measure of gin. She sat heavily in her armchair, staring at the familiar clutter, the overflowing ashtray, the village newsletter, the scarf Charles had returned. The house was quiet except for the gentle tick of the wall clock. A peaceful moment, she thought, and a rare one. She sipped her drink slowly, letting its warmth settle. Her gaze drifted to the window. The rain had eased. A faint mist curled along the lane. She always felt uneasy after a case concluded, as though the sudden lack of danger left her unsteady. But this time the feeling was different, softer, something like possibility. She thought about the portrait and the scandal it represented. She thought about Charles's confession, that glimpse of vulnerability he had shown her in his study. Tenderness, shame, pride, grief, all hidden beneath sarcasm. She wondered, briefly, what companionship might look like if neither of them spoiled it with temper or ego. Impossible, she told herself quickly, and dangerous, and terribly attractive. She reached for her cigarette packet. Hodge watched from the rug, stretching luxuriously as though judging her romantic foolishness. Don't look at me like that, she muttered. At least you're honest, Cat. She lit her cigarette. Smoke drifted into the hush of the room, curling like a quiet promise. Just then, a soft sound echoed from the hallway, a faint knock, then a slip of paper brushing the floor. Agatha rose, crossed to the door, and picked up the envelope lying on the mat. No name, no return address. She smiled slowly. A new mystery, she murmured. Knew it wouldn't stay quiet. Hodge blinked once, unimpressed as ever. Agatha tucked the envelope beneath her arm, finished her cigarette and sat back down, ready, eager, and already imagining the chase. Castley, she thought fondly, never let her rest, and she wouldn't have it any other way.